Hello, my name is Oliver Sodair, and this is the story of my childhood experience living on the west side of the Berlin Wall. Their history books will tell you that after World War II and the fall of the Third Reich, Berlin became a dividing point. East of Berlin became known as East Germany and was controlled by the Soviet Union, while West Germany became a democratic nation with the help of the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. My people became pawns in the battle between democracy and communism, otherwise known as the Cold War. My story begins in the little town of Sonnenallee, a German checkpoint between East and West Berlin. I was living with at the time my parents, grandmother, and two younger sisters. I was born in 1947, 2 years after World War II had ended. My father, who was a soldier in the war, was just beginning to get his career as a public school teacher started, and my mother stayed at home and took care of me every day. Growing up, we were constantly reminded of the war and the effects it had on all Germans. It wouldn't be till I was about 13 that the wall would begin to become constructed by Khrushchev and the Soviet powers. The Berlin blockade, instituted in 1948 by Stalin, was one thing, but the Berlin Wall would call for complete separation of Germany and its people. On August 13th, 1961 at midnight, the police and units of the East German Army began to close the border. I remember hearing tanks and soldiers gather together in a straight line dividing the east and west half of Berlin. There was a lot of confusion and fear on the look of the people's faces in my community that next day. East German troops and workers had begun to tear up the streets running alongside the border to make them impassable to most vehicles and to install barbed wire entanglements and fences along the border. As British Prime Minister Winston Churchill stated in a speech giving in Springfield, Missouri, United States, the Soviet Union was going to establish an Iron Curtain over Eastern Europe, and by God were we witnessing it firsthand in the streets of Berlin. With the closing of the East-West sector boundary in Berlin, the vast majority of East Germans could no longer travel or immigrate to West Germany. Many families were split, while East Berliners employed in West were cut off from their jobs. West Berlin became an isolate exclave in hostile land. The actual concrete wall that separated East and West Berlin wasn't built until 1965 and wasn't completed until 1967. The wall was massive. It stretched 87 miles north to south, splitting Berlin right down the middle. It was reinforced with barbed wire, multiple checkpoints, and watchtowers to control transactions between East and West Berlin. Transit between East and West Berlin was one of two ways. Either you took the two road checkpoints, Alpha or Bravo. Soviet military personnel manned these checkpoints and processed Allied personnel from travel between the 2 points. Or the other way of travel was the train, which ran all through West Berlin along the wall. The trains traveled only at night, and as with transit by car, Soviet military personnel handled the processing of duty train travelers. Over the next 20 years, Germans would stand in silence and work around the giant wall that split families and cost jobs to a lot of German men and women. In 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan gave a speech at Brandenburg Gate celebrating the 750th anniversary of Berlin. I attended this speech that would change my life forever. President Reagan challenged Soviet Union Gorbachev, asking to tear down this wall. This was a wall that was implemented when I was a 14-year-old boy, and here I am as a man, as it is asking to be torn down. This was one of the most influential experiences I'd ever had in my life, and I was already a 40-year-old man. After that speech by Ronald Reagan, things began to become tense around Berlin. Co-workers of mine began talking about the possibility of the wall being torn down in the near future. Through enough protesting and major uproar from the East Berliners, the separation of Germany began to crumble. In November of 1989, just over 2 years after Ronald Reagan's speech about the deconstruction of the wall, the plan was finally in effect. On November 9th, 1989, starting that evening and then the days and weeks that followed, people came to the wall with sledgehammers or otherwise hammers and chisels to chip off souvenirs, demolishing lengthy parts of it in the process and creating several unofficial border crossings, an institution of division between East and West Berlin that had been implemented since I was a schoolboy had ended that day. This has not only meant that it was a great day for Germans, but for humanity. I am so thankful to have lived to see the construction and deconstruction of the Berlin Wall, for it has given me a different outlook on my life. I'm only so lucky to experience something so grand.